And I would like to welcome Lottie Needham, who's going to be doing our first parallel session. Take it away.
Thank you. Let me just work out how I share like this, I think. Share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that other one. To swap this around. How do I make this like full? Presentation view. Hang on a sec. Sorry about this.
That's okay.
I want to share this screen. There we go. That looks better. Okay, thank you, Darren. Sorry about that slight delay. But yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Um, Hopefully I can live up to that the keynote just now, which I think probably needs a bit longer to digest after watching some of that documentary. Um, but yeah, this is my talk for today. My name's Lottie. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, in the School of Information Journalism and Communication. I'm part way through, so almost exactly halfway, so midway through my second year. And my sort of provisional title of my thesis and the presentation today is The Critical Library Leader in UK Academic Libraries. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a really kind of brief overview of my research topic, the way I've designed it, as well as a kind of insight into some of my initial and early findings. And I think really emphasize that it's a work in progress. This is not a finished project. This is something I'm still working on. I haven't even finished data collection, so the findings that I'm going to introduce you today are just very much kind of early thinkings and musings, stuff that I've thought of as I carry out data collection. So the project broadly examines the intersection between critical management studies and critical librarianship, what it might take to make somebody a critical library leader, and how this criticality among decision makers is used to advance social justice in UK academic libraries and as well as across their wider institution. Yeah, so as I said before, not a finished project, a work in progress, but yeah, very happy to have the opportunity today to give you an insight into some of these preliminary findings. So this is a little agenda. This is what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'll give you a brief overview of the project, um, the aims and objectives, what I'm trying to find out with my research, some key concepts that the research examines, the methodology behind the thesis, so how I went about um, trying to answer the research questions, and also an insight into who my participants were, because I think that's quite going to be quite interesting and also quite key for understanding some of the preliminary findings that I introduce. Okay, so my research aims to examine academic librarians' perceptions and understandings of both critical librarianship and critical management studies, and you might hear me during the course of this presentation abbreviate either to CritLib and critical management studies to CMS. So I'll try not to do that, but if I do, know that they refer to critical librarianship and critical management studies. And the idea is that this understanding and sort of examination of people's perceptions has a kind of broader practical aim of looking to reduce some of the inequalities that we see today in UK higher education. So I think this context is really important, like where the research is situated, and it refers primarily to things like the UK university is a neoliberal institution, the kind of inequalities that we're seeing and things like the awarding gap, and a lack of diversity amongst library and university staff. So if we think of the academic library as kind of an extension of this commodified institution and a place where maybe the values in higher education are not the same as what they might used to have been. They're much more quantified and terms and things like values have become kind of measurable in terms of metrics rather than maybe the human element that originally might have sat behind them. Um, so I was inspired to carry out this research after completing my MA librarianship dissertation. So my project in Summer 2023, which looked at the role of the academic librarian in supporting the decolonization of learning and teaching in UK universities. And it was really my findings from this study that kind of led to the idea that, yeah, maybe it was something I wanted to take further and investigate more. And so the findings from that study kind of revealed three key drivers that do support decolonization efforts in universities, and that's the kind of alignment with the institution, the proactive librarian, and the critical library leader. So the latter, the critical library leader, in supporting the proactive librarian, sort of practically in terms of time, resources, strategy, as well as in kind of less tangible efforts, things such as like establishing a culture and encouraging culture among staff, where things like critical commitments, initiatives are encouraged and supported. And so when I started thinking about this, and this is the topic that I might like to do, obviously I started reading around critical librarianship, and it's by no means a kind of new topic. It's something that's been around. It has a long history, a tradition in librarianship, but a lot of the critical kind of investigations into the area are things around like information literacy, pedagogy, instruction, critical collections, and leadership and management in university libraries was not really a thing that I'd found had this same kind of critical scrutiny attached to it, hadn't really been subjected to that same kind of lens. In fact, especially when you start to look at like critical librarianship and critical management studies and the kind of intersection between these two, there's really only one librarian, an author that I found in the US, Daniel Libor, who's applying these theories to an academic library context. So this is a qualitative research project. It aims to investigate how critical librarianship and critical management studies are understood and perceived among academic librarians. And the kind of broader, like overarching aim of the project is to kind of look at how this might be leveraged in terms of better advancing social justice goals across UK academic libraries and universities. Um, and so in terms of kind of like defining what it is that I'm trying to find out with the research, I thought it might just be easier to share with you the objectives. So what you see on the screen now are the objectives from my thesis document, which I've copied out for you. So they are to examine perceptions and understanding of critical librarianship and critical management studies among academic librarians, investigate the theoretical and practical relationship between critical librarianship and critical management studies, examine the perceived impact of critical librarianship on the library and wider university, and finally to identify the key characteristics of library leaders, critical library leaders. So these are the two key concepts that kind of underpin my study. So what are critical librarianship? What is critical management studies? So it's true, I think it's accepted that there are multiple definitions and interpretations of critical librarianship out there. And I think that can also be problematic for people. It can feel exclusionary at times. And so when I was looking for a definition of critical librarianship for the purpose of this presentation, I actually went back to, excuse me, to the about page for this conference, and I think really nicely there uses a quote from Gregory and Higgins and describes it as challenging the dominant historical, cultural, social, economic, political, and other forces that affect information. So a real kind of broadly emancipatory goal about challenging the kind of unconscious, conscious systems of oppression. So whether if you see the library as like beyond neutral and really kind of, yeah, whether unconsciously or consciously mirroring some of those systems of oppression that we see in society. And critical management studies is similar. So this applies similar in that it applies critical theory to challenge traditional management studies. So it's similarly emancipatory in its efforts kind of challenging power structures, dynamics, and like critical librarianship, it's also faced criticism for being elitist or too far removed from practical realities. Um, it's the response to this kind of idea or this criticism, there's kind of been this emerging field known as critical performativity. And put very simply, it's sort of an attempt to pragmatically foster socially progressive change in organizations. And how it does this is through meaningful engagement with management rather than critique from a distance. And the idea is that this sort of ideally results in change through sort of incremental micro-emancipations, effective, meaningful dialogue, and reflexivity. And it's really this idea of critical performativity that the US librarian Daniel Lieber has written a lot about in the context of academic library management. And it's a context that I'm kind of, or a concept, sorry, that I'm sort of very interested in exploring as part of the research. I see a lot of potential applications within the academic library, particularly around the ideas of kind of resolving, reconciling tensions around things like theory and practice, engaging in dialogue, the reflexivity, and this kind of notion of a heterotopia. So almost like a third way, instead of seeking kind of total a utopia. This sort of Foucault idea about heterotopias, I think, really plays into that and is quite potentially can be quite interesting when we look at the context of academic libraries today. So how did I go about kind of designing the project? So this is a slide about my methodology. So as I said before, it's a qualitative research project. It's informed by interpretivism, excuse me, which refers to this ontological position in which the researcher kind of interprets human behavior within the context of the subject's own social context, and social constructionism, which is a research philosophy that sort of construes knowledge as constructed socially through shared understanding and a co-constructed meaning. And it was this kind of background, this research philosophy that really kind of underpinned my decision to conduct interviews with library managers working in UK academic libraries today. I felt that having the opportunity to kind of have real in-depth conversations with people would kind of give me the best insight and understanding of their own lived experience within the and also working within the context of higher education today. So I'm using Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis when I come to conduct the analysis of the data, and then a second analysis of these findings. So Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, you kind of end up sort of an interpretive approach, and you end up with findings and themes, and then use a critical sort of theory to do a second stage analysis of those findings. And I've chosen to do this because of the fact that both concepts that I'm examining are rooted in critical theory. They're both concepts which have applied critical theory to their own profession or study. And it seemed like, well, quite a nice way of an element of continuity. Um, what that looks like exactly, so what does it mean to do a critical reading of your findings? I am still kind of working that out. So I'm not entirely sure what that might look like, but I have a few ideas that are kind of in process at the moment. But I think the reflexive element there is also kind of important to note. So that's really key with this kind of research. The researcher's own subjectivities and my own positionality is something to keep in mind when doing the research and to kind of better help me with this process. I've been keeping a diary, like a research diary, a reflexive diary, um, as I undertake the interviews. And that's been quite insightful, I think, when I look back over some of those entries, especially like from the beginning and then now a few months later as I get to the end of data collection. So let's have a look. Next slide. This is an abridged version of my call for participants. So some of you this may have landed in some of your inboxes over the course of the last few months. And I circulated this with a few kind of academic library networks, so things like Sconnell, ALN, Skirl, well, those boards, um, and as well as contacting people individually. So this is who the participants were. So initially, back in January, I conducted a small pilot study, and I interviewed two librarians at the University of Sheffield, which is my own institution where I study. And this was important to me in kind of terms of like honing the questioning, giving myself a practice at interviews because I'd done this kind of research before, but on a much smaller scale, and it had been, almost 3 years, I think, 2.5 years. So it was important to me to kind of try it out, see what works, what doesn't work. Um, and I think building my own confidence as an interviewer as well really helped with that process. So I think as of now, well, in total, I will have done 23 semi-structured interviews across the UK. So 16 different institutions. I'm going to try and break it down for you a little bit. So that's 16 institutions 11 of which were in England. Four of those are in London, institutions in London. Three of the universities are in Scotland. There's one in Northern Ireland and one in Wales. And I think like defining or categorizing a university can be quite challenging at times, but so I haven't done it for all of the institutions at this point, but five of those were Russell Group universities, four were sort of what you might call a post 92 or a former polytechnic, um, and others more recently established universities. So quite, there's quite a wide variation in student demographics, and the kind of context and situation about where these people are working. And in terms of like who they are, so I had two what I would call like a C-suite or executive level people. So that's kind of sitting above the level of university librarian or director. Think about titles maybe like chief information officer, that kind of thing. Seven directors of library services or university librarians, six assistant directors, and eight heads of services. And from that, I had three, I think, from the research sort of support side of things, things like open research, bibliometrics, and five were from student or academic services, supporting like curriculum development, student education. Um, I feel like it's important to say at this point as well, towards the kind of end of my recruitment, I became a little bit less concerned with how people identify themselves as critical. And some of my more recent interviews have actually been with people who told me before the interview that they don't really identify with the term or have never really felt that they meaningfully engaged with critical librarianship. But actually, what's kind of come out of those interviews has still been so useful and interesting. Some real like meaningful insights and insightful conversations about their perceptions of criticality and what it kind of means to lead the library in a sort of the polarized society that we're living in today. So I'm very much still in the collection stage, um, coming to the end of it now, but just be aware, yeah, I'm not fully into data analysis yet. So what I've kind of grouped together at the moment are just sort of preliminary ideas, thoughts that I've had. And what I've tried to do is to group the findings at this point into three kind of tensions, loosely use the word tension there. And the first one I've called critical v pragmatic. And by that I mean in that there appears to be a kind of understanding among participants that in order to effect real change, you have to be kind of pragmatic about what is achievable. So the criticality, the critical here, kind of refers to being able to successfully identify people or processes that you can meaningfully engage with in order to progress change. So the tension is in that kind of identifying areas. You may want to be critical, but you have to also be pragmatic about where you can be successful. So some of the quotes that came out of this are things like choosing battles, knowing which levers I can pull, looking for pockets of change. I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And I think there's a real link here to kind of Libor's application of critical performativity in the library. Kind of the sense that these people, these managers, are seeking like a third way. So rather than kind of abandon their criticality or their critical values or just quit the profession altogether. It's a kind of rejection of all or nothing thinking, I think, and it still sort of demonstrates this idea that you can still critique and be critical whilst operating within the system. And I wanted to put this grouping first, actually, because it actually feels quite hopeful, um, quite positive, and a lot of the things that I was talking about with people in these interviews are some of the challenges that people face, and they are challenges. It's a difficult environment that people are working in. Um, and this selection of findings, I just think feels quite hopeful and positive. And then the second grouping that I've got here, um, is where I haven't found like a neat kind of versus title for this yet. So I've called it the squeezed middle for now. And there is overlap, I think, between these groupings, but this is the kind of idea that the critical library leader is somebody who may be experiencing a sort of tension of responsibilities. So the idea that as you become more senior, you may feel a kind of sense of responsibility to grassroots members, so people, colleagues who aren't necessarily in the room anymore, but might share your same values. But at the same time, you're kind of closer to the top, closer to the university decision makers, which can lead to kind of pressure to conform to strategy or university policy that may or may not have be in conflict with some of those values. So some of these quotes that I've chosen today are, I feel, and what I came into this role thinking is that I will have more power as a senior manager. But all that happens is you discover there's another level of power above you, and the ceiling just moves up with you. It's like the higher up you get, the more influence you can affect, but equally, the higher up you get, the more you see behind the curtains. So you're understanding the wider context that may have been hidden from you before. And those things, they can look like barriers. They can be real barriers. And finally, this last grouping is about personal values and professional identity, which I think some of these library managers are experiencing as a kind of conflict or a tension, this tension of identity. Um, Sort of people's like desire to make a difference, maybe competing with the pressure to toe the line or play the game, as it were. And I think people's own values, especially kind of in the profession, especially in the field of librarianship, is often kind of a real reason or a core part of why people might go into the profession in the first place. And when people then become managers or choose to become managers, they may be reluctant managers, but ultimately like to think that they've had a choice in choosing the role that they're in. Um, those values might start to become challenged, or there is potentially going to be this tension. And what I'm trying to find out with this, or what I'm kind of examining, is how much people are willing to concede, sort of either in terms of their own personal or professional identity. So some of these quotes include, I bring my activism to work. I thought going into management, I'm not going to be able to do that anymore. The most I might be doing is offering backfill or cover. That's the most I'm going to do. Am I going to lose the core center of why I want to work in libraries in the first place? And finally, I chose to include this last quote just because I think it's just such a really positive sentence and sentiment. Every intersection of my identity found a home in the library. Um, and I think that really shows or demonstrates that people see themselves in what they do, that there is this overlap in personal and professional, and when there's a kind of conflict between those feelings of identity, then that's a real challenge for people. Um, so yeah, I've been really lucky in the study. People have spoken very openly, been very candidly and sometimes critical about the institutions that they're working in. And I think it's that kind of willingness to be open and honest that will ultimately that will really help the project. Like without that kind of commitment and openness, it just I wouldn't be able to do the work that I'm doing. So my last slide is just TBC, and by that I mean I'm very much in the thick of well, I'm about to start data analysis now, so I'm still very much working out these issues. I haven't connected all of the dots yet. So what I've shown you today may not be what I show future presentations in the next year or so as I continue with interviews and my analysis. Um, but yeah, I'm really grateful for you for coming to listening, being open to hearing some kind of early ideas and musings, and I'm especially thankful to my participants. I put my email address up there because I know sometimes in conferences and present when you listen to presentations, you might need maybe a bit more time to kind of process or digest what you thought of, and sometimes the question doesn't come right away. So I've shared that there. If you think of something later and you want to ask or have an idea that you'd like to share, then please do feel free to contact me. But yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Lottie. Did you want to take any questions today, or was it just if you wanted them emailed to you?
I'm happy if we've got time, I'm happy to answer anything.
We have got
Um,
5 minutes, yeah.
yeah.
I can see some questions in the chat. If you do want to ask a question vocally, just pop your hand up and I'll try and get to you. There's a question from Holly. which
Mhm.
says the 16 UK librarians you interview, was their feedback similar to the one Ireland-based librarians, or was there a difference there?
Yeah, so I've done one interview with a librarian from an institution in Northern Ireland. So it's just UK-based institutions. So not no one from Southern Ireland, not the Republic of Ireland. Um, I did that interview yesterday, so I couldn't say whether I haven't listened back to the transcript yet, so I don't think I'm sort of equipped at this point to say whether or not, excuse me, there's a real difference yet. Um, excuse me. But I will say they were grateful to be included. There was a kind of sense that maybe Northern Irish universities not always represented, and felt like it was meaningful to have their voice heard. So I'm pleased that I was able to find participants there because that was a kind of last minute recruitment decision that I didn't have that full spread across the UK, and that felt important to me to have kind of that representation across the whole of the UK.
Well, thank you. I'll let you take a, a drink.
Sorry,
You've been
yeah.
talking for a while. Yeah, and I know what you mean. I didn't manage to get to interview anyone from North Ireland because I was doing in-person interviews and I couldn't quite make it. Um,
Yeah, it's even more challenging. These are all online, so it's a
yeah.
little bit easier in terms of time
Um,
and money resources.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for maybe one other question. I can see there's one from Nadine. Um, does your critical leadership and management account for middle management and the rest of the team? Can they make a leader more critical?
Good question. So I have tried to interview a range of management levels. So when I initially kind of drew up the criteria for the study, it was people who had a kind of responsibility over a service or personnel responsibility, and often that kind of coalesces. Um, but didn't talk to people who were maybe like informal managers, so people that you might perceive among the group as leaders or managers, but aren't recognized as such. Because for me, what's really interesting is people who kind of would call themselves critical and engage in critical work, but are actually, they are in those kind of powerful or higher up decision making positions in the university. Um, I don't know whether or not I would say yes, that they could make the leader more critical. A lot of people, when I asked about kind of leadership style or whether they kind of subscribe to a management framework or things like that, there's a lot of talk about like collaborative leadership, a democratic approach, and people felt very inspired by their team, wanting to have people's voices heard. And I think that's probably, you could identify that as a kind of skill of the critical library leader in like fostering that openness among the team, like having a culture where people feel like they can bring something to you and it's going to be taken seriously.
Lovely, thank you. Right, well, we've got just 1 minute left. So if everybody in the chat could just express their thank you to Lottie. That was really excellent presentation. And I feel a bit bad having to go after you now. So you set a high bar. Thank you very
Not at
much.
all. Thank you very much. Thanks.